Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited. My name is Lisa Kaplowitz. I am a finance professor here at Rutgers Business School and the co-founder and executive director of the Rutgers Center for Women in Business, where we do three things: remove barriers, build community, and empower women with confidence and skills. I am so excited today to be joined by Joanne Lipman. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
As we discuss not her latest book, which we'll talk about in a second next, which we will talk about next, but her other book called That's What She Said, which is really aiming to do three things that are all part of our mission: removing barriers, building community — that was the concept of the book club — and empowering women. Now, I just want to talk quickly about the genesis of this book club. I know a lot of you went to our regional book clubs, and some of you may not have, but this was a concept we created and we just launched it with this first book. So we're grateful Joanne's here with us. And the concept is that as we come out of the pandemic, what we've been hearing from folks is that we're missing community and we're missing that connectivity, and humans are social beings. And so we thought, hey, why not come together to discuss very topical issues that are going through our lives, and do it through literature, through amazing folks that have written about it, so we can learn as well, but also come together with some peeps that we might not have known before. So that's the genesis of this, and then culminating with a talk back with the author herself. So let me brag about Joanne for a second before we get started. This is being recorded only so we can show it to more folks, because we're hoping this is going to be amazing and fabulous. And I'll tell you what our next book's going to be as well. But we want you all to interact. We have some questions set up. Some of the leaders have posted questions as well. So who is Joanne? Joanne is a best-selling author multiple times over. We are reading That's What She Said, which was a #1 bestseller. And she's recently written a new book, which, Joanne, I don't know if it is a bestseller already, but it will be if not. Next, The Power of Reinvention in Life and Work. She has been a first in many, many experiences, especially at work. She was the editor-in-chief at USA Today, the USA Today Network, Condé Nast Portfolio, and the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Journal. She has led these organizations to win 6 Pulitzer Prizes. 6, that's a lot. She's a frequent speaker and commentator and on-air contributor at CNBC. She is a journalism lecturer at Yale University and was also named a Distinguished Journalism Fellow at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies. She's been dubbed a star editor by CNN, an innovator-in-chief by the New York Times. Just amazing. I could go on and on, but I know we want to talk about the book. Thank you, Joanne, for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me. Some of you may know that I'm actually an East Brunswick, New Jersey native, and pretty much everybody else in my family went to Rutgers. So I am loyal, and you can see I'm wearing my Rutgers red today.
We love it.
Go Scarlet Knights.
Yes, go RU. So Joanne, let me just start out, and I'll call on some other folks that I know have submitted questions, and we'll open it up to the audience as well. What led you to write That's What She Said? What led you to do all this research on this book?
Yeah. So That's What She Said. It actually grew out of an article that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal. The headline was "Women at Work, a Guide for Men." And the reason I wrote it, it was an article, it went viral, and it really prompted me to write the book. And the reason I did is because, I spent the first 22 years of my career at the Wall Street Journal, 23 if you count when I was an intern in college. And when I joined, it was primarily male. All of my mentors were men. The people I wrote about were men. The people who read the paper were men. But what was interesting is I had a really great experience there, and I had wonderful male mentors. And yet, as I started sort of rising up in leadership, and I'd get invited to these women's conferences, and as I'm sure you all know, like, women's conferences are awesome. They're like a warm bath, right? Because you're all sharing the experiences that you have and some of the challenges that we face. But at some point along the way, I get a little frustrated because I realized that we were sharing things with each other that we already knew, but the men didn't know because we weren't sharing it with them. And I thought, I know a lot of good guys, and frankly, they are kind of clueless, but it's not their fault. It's like, we need to share this with them. And so that was why I wrote the Wall Street Journal piece, knowing it was mostly men who'd be reading it. And I was really gratified by the response. And I realized that, women talking to each other is great, but it's half a conversation and it gets us to 50% of a solution. And we really need men to join us. And I know that there are a lot of men out there who would like to join us and to be on the same page and be allies in this fight for gender equality. So that's what led to writing the book.
I love that. And I think that thought process resonates so well, even with me personally. As a finance professor, I'm actually working with students to publish cases about finance, not about pink industries that are gendered, but just the only difference is the fact that her name might be Aisha or, Louisa or something else that isn't John.
Exactly.
Because she needs to be, her voice needs to be heard, and my students need to see themselves in what we're studying in class as well. So I love that. And I think, they're still mostly men, so they need to see that there are women in leadership. That's awesome. Let's talk about how women's lived experiences bring diversity to the workplace and how that improves. Not only, it's not just the right thing to do, but how that improves financial performance and workplace culture. You mentioned a couple different stories. One I loved was about Brownie and the Tupperware story.
Yes. So as you mentioned, first of all, there's a boatload of research, and even more since I wrote the book, that just shows you when you have diverse leadership and diverse organizations, everything improves. Everything from your financial results to your return on equity, to your employee retention, right? Employee happiness. Every metric is going to be better. But if that doesn't convince you, I love this story about Tupperware. The guy who actually invented Tupperware was a serial entrepreneur, and when he invented it, it was with this plastics after World War II, and he couldn't figure out how to market it. It was a really cool new invention because before then people didn't know how to keep their food fresh. So here you have this airtight seal, but he got it into stores. It got into MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, because it was so beautiful and cool, but nobody was buying it. And it wasn't until he met this woman, Brownie Wise. So Brownie Wise had sort of marshaled this sales team of women, other women who, by the way, this is after World War II. Women during World War II, they got to go to work and they got a taste of it, and they really enjoyed working. They also enjoyed making money. But then they were all sent back to the kitchen when all the men came home from the war. So she very cleverly marshaled this sales force of women to, first she was selling things like mops and brooms and stuff door to door, but then she hit on this idea of Tupperware, and that was magic, right? So she was able to marshal these women to show other women how to use it. She invented the idea of the Tupperware party. And then she incentivized her sales force in amazing ways, like, like burying diamonds in the headquarters and having people dig for it. I mean, kind of crazy things. But anyway, it was because of Brownie Wise combined with the original founder of Tupperware that you were able to have this massive success. Of course, the corollary to that story is, at the end, she grew it into this massive success. It really showed you how it was this, you needed the combination, this diverse group to really make this a huge success. But at the end of the day, he got very jealous when Brownie Wise was put on the cover of Business Week magazine. And that was when he felt like she was infringing on his turf, and he fired her. So, we have come a long way since then, but I love the story because it shows you sort of the power of thinking differently. I talked to, when I wrote the book, I talked to the then CEO, a longtime CEO of Tupperware, who talked about how important it was to have women on his team. And it wasn't just, as he said, he wasn't doing it for the, just because it was the right thing to do or because he was woke or anything like that. He just said it just made business sense. And in fact, he talked about one of the items that they made that was supposed to be a jewelry holder, and it was made by a bunch of guys who modeled it on like fishing tackle boxes. And he said, you needed customers. You need your customers to actually help you understand what they need. And what they need is not a fishing tackle box. So,
Right.
yes, yeah. But it's a wonderful story, their entire story, which I've heard since may be made into a movie.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yes.
I also remember reading about the introduction. I can't remember if it was tampons or maxi pads somewhere. And it was a bunch, you probably know what I'm talking about. It was a bunch of guys trying to sell into the grocery stores and the drugstores. And it wasn't resonating with anyone because the people on the other side were guys and these were guys. And of course, they weren't using them.
Right. So this was the then CEO of Kimberly-Clark. And
Right.
so they have Kotex and all of these, feminine products. And what was happening was they were struggling with sales of these feminine products. And they had, he describes this board meeting, and it's all men, and the leaders of the feminine product category, a bunch of men, get up to make the presentation about the feminine product category. And they show the ads, which is, women in white riding on white horses and twirling around in white on a beach.
Right.
And the CEO said he had this aha moment that like the optics of this are terrible. And it's kind of no surprise that we're not doing well with women when I look at the people who are interpreting women's feminine hygiene needs. And so he changed up, the organization, but he changed up the whole organization in terms of realizing that, he looked at his org chart and he said, we've got all men and our consumers are 80% female, at least. And we've got all men telling them, here's the products we're making for you and here's how you should buy it. And he realized it was a business imperative that he really needed to diversify. And he did. And he changed up the marketing team too. And I love this, the first marketing campaign after he brought these women in, the title of the marketing campaign was Apology. And it was, they brought in just regular normal women, not necessarily wearing white and nobody twirling around in white on a beach. Just talking realistically about their periods and the whole idea of the campaign was like, yeah, we've been pulling one over on you and we're real women and we want to talk about real periods. And it was highly successful.
And it also destigmatized menstruation overall, which is also important, which is Absolutely. Great. No, I love that. And I think we see that playing out now with some of these beauty brands. I think some of the major beauty houses totally missed out because they were making products that might show up on my skin, but they're not going to show up on a Black woman's skin or won't translate as well to an Asian woman. And so it's this huge missed opportunity from an economic standpoint.
Yes. And that's what all of them meant. So I really sought out when I was writing, that's what she said. I sought out male executives who were trying to get this right. And basically all of them said, yes, it's the right thing to do, but that's not why I did it. I did it because I'm seeing this massive missed opportunity in the marketplace. And we're missing the opportunity because we're not diversified in terms of gender or in terms of race and ethnicity. We're just not diversified enough in our own organizations. And that is leading us to have this major missed opportunity. By the way, we see this, the beginning of this again happening right now. I've been absolutely fascinated. The New York Times just ran a massive story, and there was another one that I just read this morning, I think in one of the business magazines, about menopause and about the multi-$100 billion business that for women who have been ignored, like women who are having these symptoms of whether it's hot flashes or sleep disruptions or whatever else, dry skin, like there's a million of these opportunities that women have had to live with and that have led to, by the way, hundreds of thousands of days of missed days of work that companies have ignored. And now they're seeing it not just as the right thing to do, but as an incredibly lucrative potential new market.
So I have been looking at this and thinking about this a lot lately. I'm 49, so I'm like in the demo. But also from an economic standpoint, so nothing that what I say is gonna constitute any kind of financial advice or anything else. My Series 7 and 63 degrees or licenses are long gone. So I'm not giving anyone any financial advice right now. That's my disclaimer. But I think this is a hot market. Wellness is really hot right now. Health is really hot. And I think menopause is going to be heavily invested in the coming years, which is really interesting. And I'm going to personally be a beneficiary of that.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's again an overlooked market, and now you've got the entire baby boom generation that is in that demo. So Absolutely. It's a giant chunk. Yeah.
And I love, Joanne, what your book and the approach to it, because it wasn't about shaming men. It's about introducing them and raising our awareness. Most men haven't walked in our high heels. And so they don't know what we're experiencing. And so that's what really resonated with me. One of the themes that we focus on at the center at Rutgers for the Center of Women in Business is actionable male allyship. So can you talk for a second about our biases, because we all have them, and how can we, overcome those?
Right. So I'm sure everybody here knows about unconscious bias by this point. What was really fascinating to me, we all have these unconscious biases. And it's tricky. It's very tricky because we now have unconscious bias training. But, when you think about it, what some of the research that's in the book was fascinating to me, the idea that, when Google looked at people who, for parents of 2-year-olds who Google, is my child a genius? Something that I would probably do.
Right, of course, me too.
But parents who Google that overwhelmingly Google that about a male 2-year-old rather than a female 2-year-old. And we still see to this day the kind of research, like there was one that I cite in the book about 6-year-olds who were given a math test. And when they were graded with no names on it, the girls in the class outscored the boys, but when you put the names on it, the boys outscored the girls. And we see this as adults. We see, a college student, a girl needs to have, a young woman needs to have an A average to be seen as the equal to a male student with a B average. And then we see it in the workplace, not just with, differences in salary, but we also see it in things like, at Google, I know when I was researching the book that female code, when you knew it was a female, was rejected more often than male code. And when GitHub, which is open source coding, they did this experiment where they took the gender away from the coder, female code was accepted more frequently. So the conclusion is that women are better coders if you were only to look anonymously, but when you put the gender back on, the female code was disproportionately rejected. So we're still dealing with these biases that are with us every day. And so the important thing is for us to at least be aware of it. I've certainly tried so hard since doing all that research to be aware of it myself, but we're guilty of it. I think about in my own family, I have a daughter and a son. And when my kids were young, I remember my daughter saying to me one day, she said, every night after dinner, you tell me to clear the table. You never say that to Andrew, my brother. And I was like, oh my gosh.
So Joanne, I did in my research, I actually found, I didn't write this, but when I was looking at stuff to prepare for something, teenage girls do 50% more chores than teenage boys.
Yep. And women still, even though women increasingly are the primary wage, whatever. Yes.
They make more money than, even if they're the breadwinner.
They make more money than their husbands, and yet they do more housework than the husbands.
Right. So I like to say that when, that term, doing it all or having it all was coined in the 80s, it never meant that she was supposed to do the laundry and change the diapers and earn the paycheck. And, or just what that all even defines. That's a whole separate conversation, maybe for another book that you have. Can you talk about tiara syndrome? I hadn't heard it. I probably should have, but I hadn't heard it until I read your book. What is
Yeah.
it, and what should women and men do to eliminate it?
Yeah, so there are two women who are actually career coaches who coined this phrase, tiara syndrome, but it resonated so much when I first heard about it. So the idea of tiara syndrome is that while men generally very often are the ones who are like aggressively asking for the promotion or demanding the promotion, and as somebody who has been a manager for well over 2 decades of my career, I can tell you that there was constant stream of men in my office saying, I should have that job. I should have this promotion. And a lot of them weren't remotely qualified, but they were squeaky wheels, and they put themselves out there, and it almost never happened with women, almost never. And the tiara syndrome explains why, which is that women expect to be recognized and noticed for the great work that they are doing and recognized for it. So as in, we bestow the tiara on you, we give you the promotion. And I definitely suffered from that myself. And I was very, very, very fortunate, which I realized I was in a minority, that I had male bosses who recognized my potential and offered me promotions and came to me when I wasn't looking for promotions, which is exceedingly rare, even now, exceedingly rare. So this tiara syndrome is something that we need to be aware of, but also I think that bosses, male and female, we all need to, anybody who's a manager who's listening today, like we all need to be aware of this, and you got to look at who's asking for the promotion versus who deserves the promotion.
I think that's so important, Joanne. And just because she's not asking, and I love, as you wrote about it in the book, how many times some of your managers kept coming back and are you ready now? Are you ready now? Are you ready now? Which is great. We run this program called GAME, Generating Allyship and Male Executives, for male executives. And one of the guys who participated in our program came out, and we were talking about advocating for change or just institutionalizing the allyship. And he actually turned down a promotion because it required a lot of international travel. And he was getting a lot of pushback from his manager saying, come on, what are you talking about? He wanted to coach his kids' teams and he wanted to be around more. And as a millennial, I think that's much more common, which I love, by the way. And he said, he posed this question to our group and said, are we actually doing a disservice? Because when men say this, we're chastising them. But then when women say this, we aren't encouraging them to go forward. And are we doing a disservice to both genders? And I thought that was really insightful.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, the one thing that I learned and that I recognized in reporting, that's what she said, is how important it is to not cross women off the list, not cross anyone off the list, but particularly do not cross women off the list. If they do want to, take a breather, if they want to reject a promotion because it would require too much travel, for whatever reason, if she wants to dial back. And this was the key, which I realized in my own career, was when my kids were babies, it was overwhelming. I was at the Wall Street Journal. I was in a position at that moment. I was an editor on page 1, which meant that I wasn't out there reporting at all hours. I had fairly normal hours.
Right.
I was rewriting other people's copy. It was a wonderful job. My bosses kept asking me if I wanted to put my hand up, like, would you be interested in the London bureau chief, which is a big deal in the newspaper, or the Los Angeles bureau chief. Like, they were offering me promotions and I kept saying no, but they never took my name off the list, which was amazing. And this went on for almost 5 years until my younger child, my son, entered kindergarten. And my boss came to me and said, at that time it was a 3-section paper. He said, we want to create a brand new section of the paper, a 4th section, blue sky it. Would you like to do that? And I was like, hell yes, of course I would. And it was both, the job was amazing. It was an amazing opportunity. It actually turned into a weekend journal, but
which I love, and I read all the time.
It was so much fun to do it, but it was a combination of an amazing opportunity with the fact that now I had 2 kids who were actually in school all day. And that was the only reason that I could do it. But what's extraordinary in retrospect is that they never crossed me off the list. And I learned from that. The other thing that I learned is about, the people who put their hands up. While I was reporting That's What She Said, I was also running USA Today, and it changed the way I manage. So one of the things that I did is I noticed, all these men same guys coming into my office all the time, demanding a promotion. But what I started doing when there were openings is I would go out into the newsroom and I would talk to women. I'd bring the women into my office just to say, you haven't, there'd be certain women, I would say, you are qualified to be in the pool. I'm not telling you to get the job, but you are definitely qualified to raise your hand for this promotion, but you didn't. And I'm not saying you have to, but you can. And if you don't, let's just talk about your future and what you think and what are your interests. And it just changed the way that I interacted with people. And, it makes them feel seen, but it's also great for me as a manager. I learned so much more about women who might've been hanging back, who had a ton to offer, but just weren't aggressively putting it forward. And I found some hidden gems of amazing talent that, might otherwise have been overlooked.
I love that. And I think, that might even stem from your managers having that vested interest in you. Which is great because there's also that double bind backlash. I tried to raise my hand and I was working at a Fortune 500 company and I was 2 down from the CEO. And I remember the CEO telling me, I was trying to talk about my career, telling me, well, you know what, as soon as you have that baby, you're not going to, be as anxious about your career. And this wasn't, my kids turning 17 in a couple of weeks. So it's not that long ago.
It is not.
That this happened. Yeah. So I wish there were more managers like you, Joanne. I want to turn it over to one of our book club leaders. Kasha, first of all, thank you for leading one of the book clubs. And go ahead with your question.
Thank you. So first off, Joanne, it's such an honor to be in your presence. The book was so informative and so enlightening. And the number of biases, like you said, we possess even as women towards other women, was eye-opening to me as well. And, I've tried ever since, right? Every day, I keep that in the back of my mind. So this way, I'm cognizant because I have 2 girls myself. So I want to make sure that, hey, I am putting my best foot forward as a parent. And my husband has since tried as well to incorporate many of those things. So he does that in his professional life and personal life. So thank you so much. And Lisa and Viviana, I can't thank you guys enough for the terrific program you both are leading. Viviana, I think I see you almost every week now, one way or another. But thank you so much. Appreciate everything you guys do. Joanne, the question I have is, I have been in corporate America now for over 20 years. And been in the B2B technology space. So many of the things you mentioned have resonated with me. Conscious and unconscious biases, right? I have seen both. All the isms that you mentioned, experience all of them as well, right? And, I'm a first generation Asian woman. I'm from India, right? And, the way, again, just the way life has worked for the most part, and what we've been taught is it's the survival of the fittest. All right. You go get it, and instead of, many a time supporting each other, let's pull each other down because that's the only way to get ahead. That's what, consciously and unconsciously, what we've seen, what we mirrored, right? And that's how we kind of played the game, that's the only way to get ahead. And until recently, I used to play a similar game. Because I didn't know there was another option. And I didn't know how else to do it because, like I said, being a first generation Asian woman, and it's like you have all these pressures that you're feeling and you're like, okay, I got to make it, right? Somewhere in the back of your mind, that's what's playing. And, of course, now I am much more aware and cognizant that no, that's not the way to do it, right? You have to pull each other up, support each other, because life is not a what do you call it? Sort of a zero net game. No, there is enough for everybody, right? But, the one thing I've experienced, like I said, and is that mentality over and over again that the only way to get up is by pulling you down, right? And I see that more and more often than I would like to. So how do we promote a culture, Joanne, that favors collaboration and contribution over competition, right? And more so, around women, honestly, more so around women, because I feel like if we could be our greatest allies, we could probably fight the world, right? Similar to the Avengers, like I'm a big Avengers fan, and the last one that I saw when the girl pack comes together, the women pack comes together, wow, was that a moment? But that's, I feel like if we could do more of that, right? And bring more women together and show that we're allies in this, I think we could, it will be easier to bring other genders into the fold. So I hope, I gave you the context, and I hope that wasn't too long-winded.
No, this is great. I really appreciate everything you said. And so, yeah, a couple of thoughts on this. And I have given a lot of thought, and pretty much every time I speak about the book, I hear some version of exactly what you just said. So just some context on what we're talking about is essentially the queen bee syndrome, particularly among women. My hope is that is declining, and I am an optimist by nature, so I'm very hopeful about that. But the reason is there is a reason it exists, and the reason is real. And the reason is that when women first started coming into the workplace in the 70s and the 80s, there only was the woman's slot. And as someone who's a first generation immigrant, you have that double bind, right? Because there was always like the person of color slot. And so, and it literally was a slot, which meant that women and people of color were only competing against each other. They were not competing with the general population of all of everybody at work. And that's why we ended up with this queen bee syndrome, which is one woman gets promoted and she pulls up the ladder behind her because she knows that if she gets knocked off, that, that all these other women are all vying for her slot. There's a whole bunch of other women waiting to take her one spot. So the reason that I remain optimistic is because as we have more women in leadership, that we will have less of that, because it'll be a more equal playing field where we are all competing, for our, whatever the next step is. So I think that is one issue, but also I think that when you do get more women in leadership, you sort of naturally will bring other women into leadership when people do feel that more confident about the role that they play. And I think about, I for many years, I actually, gender was not top of mind for me, to be very honest. It just wasn't something that I was thinking about on a daily basis. And yet when I became a manager for the first time, and I look back at what my teams were much more diverse than the teams of male managers. And I look back on that, and then when I left the Wall Street Journal and I went to Condé Nast, and I created a new magazine. And in terms of gender, my top leadership team was even 50-50, which was unheard of at a business magazine. And but it wasn't even intentional. I was just looking for the best people. And so I think when you have more women in leadership, it leads to that. But I do also think there are things, in the back of That's What She Said, there's about a dozen strategies that I point out, and we can talk about a few of them, because women, we can be our best allies, and it will help everyone. I have a wonderful friend and longtime colleague who has this saying that I love so much. She says, the success pie is infinitely expandable. Like, just because you're a success doesn't mean that I can't be a success as well. And I really, truly, truly believe that. And I don't know, we can talk through, I'll take some more questions, but if you'd like, we can talk through a few of these strategies that women and men can use that are going to pull each other up as opposed to push them down.
Yeah, so let's talk through some of these, Joanne, because I know there are a lot in there, but which ones have you seen resonate the most or get the most impact? I'm all about impact.
Yeah, I would say there's probably three that are my favorites. So one is just interrupt the interrupters, because as you've seen in the book, like, women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men. And that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Female Supreme Court justices interrupted 3 times more frequently than male justices. And I do feel this is something any one of us can do at any level. If you're in a meeting, listen for that person, whoever it is, who is being interrupted and not being heard. And it's as easy as saying, oh, wait, Lisa was speaking. I'd love to hear her finish. And literally you don't have to be leading the meeting to do that. So that's one simple thing. Very often we just don't hear it, right? So you have to listen for it to see who is being ignored in that meeting. A second related one is amplification, which is another, like meetings, as I say in the book, they're like the killing fields of a women's career, because men just tend to be so damn aggressive and they're pounding the table and they're dominating the conversation. And women have a hard time with that. I mean, women have a hard time being heard. And so something that happens very frequently, and I would be very curious of those of you in the meeting today, how many of you have ever had that situation where you say something and nobody seems to hear it? And 2 minutes later, a guy repeats exactly your point, exactly what you were saying. And everybody turns to him and they're like, oh, Bob, great idea you had, Bob. And he gets the credit. And you're sitting there, right? Like who's, I mean, that has happened to me. I can't even tell you how many times.
Yep.
And it's happened.
Mansplaining, right?
Yeah.
It's called mansplaining.
Well, but it's not even this just mansplaining. It's literally taking your idea. It's literally, they didn't quite hear that you said it, but it went into their head and they think it's their idea. And then they say, I mean, I've seen this on television where a woman on like one of the, they're in the boxes and a woman and the male anchor says, oh, well, you know, Stephen, that was a great point you just made, when it was actually Susan who made it, right? It happens it happens to all of us. But anyway, this idea of amplification is my second strategy that I love, which literally is, and you have your sort of ally in advance who you've, you know, worked this out with, where we're in a meeting together. Lisa, you and I are in a meeting together. You start to say something, and before Bob can pipe up and take your idea, I say, oh, Lisa, what an interesting idea you had, blah, blah, blah. And I amplify your idea by name, which does two things. It gives you the credit for it so that Bob can't take credit for your idea. So everybody knows it's your idea, but it also amplifies your point to give you more credibility in what you are saying. So that's extremely effective. And then I'll mention one more, which is another of my favorites, which is brag buddies. So as we know from the research, and it is unfortunate, but still true, when men talk about themselves, we give them credit and we say, wow, you're awesome, when he tells you how awesome he is. When women talk about our own credentials and our own achievements, we tend to be dinged for it. We're penalized because we are all of those female coded things. Like we are, you know, we're stuck up and we're too aggressive and we're too pushy and we're too full of ourselves. Like all of these things that you only talk about with women. And so it's unfortunate. We need to, like, that's one of our biases that we have to work against. But while it exists, brag buddies is the idea that, again, Lisa, you and I are colleagues. I share my great achievements with you, you share yours with me, and then we both go and brag to the boss about the other one. And this was created by women in a consulting firm who created this brag buddies idea, because they were, you know, they're one of the major brand name consulting firms, and their ideas were simply not being heard. And they were also felt like they were not being credited. They were not given credit for their own initiatives. And so again, this is a way, it's very effective. By the way, one of the reasons it's effective is because the research shows that women are as effective and generally actually more effective than men when it comes to advocating on behalf of other people, right?
Yeah.
We get dinged for advocating on behalf of ourselves. We get credit and we do really well. We are really great at advocating for other people.
Absolutely. And what's even more effective is having that brag buddy be somebody that doesn't look like you. So when it's mixed gendered, a male amplifying her is actually going to carry even more weight than a woman amplifying another woman, or a white woman amplifying a Black woman is going to give even more weight, because there's that concept that it doesn't have any self-serving to it whatsoever.
That's so right. 100%. Yes. Exactly. Mix it up with, the person who doesn't look like you. And men, when they are aware of this, by the way, it's very easy for them to become the amplifier or the brag buddy, or the person who interrupts the interrupters, right? These are all strategies that apply equally for men and women. And by the way, I should actually also mention that when I do these talks to mixed gender audiences, and I've gone to a lot of very male dominated companies and spoken about the book, and almost always men, I will have like a few men come up to me privately afterward and say, I'm a shy man, and everything you're talking about actually applies to me too, which I found really interesting because in addition to sort of these traditional male qualities that seem to dominate, it's also this traditional sort of aggressive, extroverted culture that tends to dominate, that's hard on introverted men as well as on women and people of color and anybody who's marginalized in a room.
And I think that's true. That whole concept of toxic masculinity really hurts a lot of men because they don't want to fit into this one paradigm. It's interesting, we wrote an article fairly recently about the 5 ways women had to adapt. We called them maladaptations to survive in corporate America. And I shared it with a group of men and they said, well, we experience these same things too. And so I love these eye-opening moments. I need to be perfect. I need to do it alone. I need to sacrifice to succeed. I have one more question on this book because I know we're running out of time. And it comes from Olivia Wabin, who's one of our former students and now heads up our associate board as co-chair. She said, since writing That's What She Said in 2018, what additions or subtractions would you make to reflect the progress or lack of progress in gender equity? If you had to do a new chapter, what would you call it?
Yeah, I don't know if it would be a new chapter, but I think I can think of 2 adjustments that I think I need to make. And one definitely is, I was very binary. This was like men and women. And where I did definitely talk about, underrepresented women, I think we are much, much more cognizant now than we were then of intersectional issues, of, issues with the LGBT community. It really is. So much of the research that I cite wasn't actually just about women. It was about whoever is marginalized in the room. Right. And that can be, right, we're talking people of color, the LGBTQ community, we're talking about shy men, like and so I think I would be a little bit more cognizant of that. And I would need to, I guess if there was another chapter, it would have to be about the backlash that we've had recently. So we had Me Too, which brought a lot to light. We are experiencing this sort of woke backlash where suddenly gender equality, which should not be a political issue or a cultural issue at all. And I wrote this with 0 political lens, this book. And now it has become part of the culture wars. And I think this is really problematic and very concerning. I've been extremely concerned about backsliding, though I have to say in the last week, we are seeing like a backlash to the backlash a little bit, because if you look at the very high profile firings in the last week in the media industry, Tucker Carlson, Don Lemon at CNN, and a guy named Jeff Shell who ran NBC, and all 3 to varying degrees had to do with mistreatment of women. And now you have the Trump rape lawsuit that's going on. So you do now start to see a little bit of a backlash to the backlash, which is encouraging. But boy, my real hope, and when I first did the research in the book, I would have hoped that we would have made more progress and solidified the progress instead of seeing backsliding.
Yeah, I think I share that same concern that you have about the backlash as well, and seeing it, and just what I hear from some recent graduates. I'm a finance professor, so they go into finance, and these issues in finance are unfortunately live and not well. Right. So in media maybe, but in finance, I still think we're lagging a lot. And then I think your comment on gender fluidity, I have 2 teenage boys, and they identify as boys, but gender among their peers is very fluid, and it's it's not nearly as binary as we grew up thinking, even within LGBTQ community.
Exactly.
There's a lot more plus.
I gave a Google talk at the Googleplex, and I remember I was walking in, and I'm talking to an engineer as we're chatting as we were walking in, and he asked me what I was speaking about, and I said, that's what she said about gender and closing the gender gap, and he looks at me kind of disdainfully, and he said, well, there are 12 genders. And like, you realize, like, we are in a more fluid world, and we really do need to recognize that. When the book very, very, very first came out, I remember in my talks, I would have to ask audiences, are you familiar with the term intersectionality? Because it was,
right.
We don't even recognize how actually that is a fairly recent understanding, which, by the way, I think is a plus, that we now, that now this is throughout society. Like, yes, we all understand about this fluidity.
Right.
And so that is progress.
Right. Which is so interesting that I'd say in the last couple of years, intersectionality has become more aware, but Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term years and years ago. But right. Joanne, I want to go to next, your next project that's already out. So I'm taking this book down because we've already talked about it. And here's the next one, which I read. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk about it because I found it fascinating. As I told you beforehand, I'm on my 5th career. And as I pivoted and switched, I didn't even realize I was using a framework, but it's exactly the framework that you explained in the book. So can you talk a little bit more about your latest project?
Yeah, sure. So next, it's called Next, the Power of Reinvention in Life and Work. And what it is, it's a deeply reported guide, that's what she said. But it's a deeply, deeply reported guide to navigating change in the way that we live, the way we work, the way we lead. And it's backed by hundreds of interviews that I did with people who have had really significant changes in their lives, whether like career change or life-changing aha moments, or coming back from failure, some of them coming back from trauma. And then I also added in these interviews, insights from the experts who study the process of change, whether we're talking neuroscientists who study what happens to your brain when you have an aha moment, management gurus like yourself, Lisa, people who study career change, and companies that can, come back from the dead and be innovative. And the reason I wrote it, though, is for this moment in time. I started reporting it literally in April of 2020, which was the moment that we all realized that this pandemic thing was real and it wasn't going to go away in 2 weeks. And we had no idea how long it would last or what would the world look like afterward. And I literally woke up in the middle of the night with this, again, aha moment, thinking, we've got to figure out what is the new normal and how do we get there. And this is something that this is global. All of us are going to have to figure out. There's no guide. There's no guidebook to show us the way. And so I actually wrote an email to my publisher that morning and said, this is what I want to do. We need this roadmap. And they're like, yes, please. So I've been reporting it ever since. And it really is because we have seen that so many of us are rethinking, and particularly, because of the last 3 years, like reprioritizing our lives and rethinking our relationship to our jobs, even rethinking like what is a good job and what is my definition of success. And a lot of people are feeling unmoored at this moment, which I have really found very powerfully in the response to Next. It's a moment in time, I think, that so many of us are in this place of struggle. And so what I did is when I interviewed all these people, I asked them to walk me through their own process of change. So this ranged, by the way, from people like James Patterson, the author,
which was super cool. I know we're not talking about this book, but he had like a massive career before he started writing. I mean, not started writing, but publishing.
So when I was a young Wall Street Journal reporter, just very quickly, I first met him more than 30 years ago. I was a young reporter and I was writing about the Burger King campaign because I covered advertising. So I went to talk to the head of the Burger King advertising account, and it was James Patterson. And he was an ad guy who was a struggling writer. We sat down, he's like, yeah, well, I'll tell you about Burger King, but what I really want to be is a writer. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, sure. Like you and everybody else, right? Sure, guy. And literally, like, he becomes the best-selling author of all time. I got back in touch with him. I asked him to walk me through, how did you get from struggling writer ad exec to where you are today, which he very graciously did. But fascinatingly, his process, the stages he went through was pretty much the same as people who you would think have nothing to do with him. Like, a guy was a telephone repairman for years, who's now a women's shoe designer. And I said, like, how did you get from there to here? And they go through the same set of stages. So I call it the reinvention roadmap. And it has 4 stages: search, struggle, stop, solution. I will tell you very quickly, because we're running out of time, but I'll just tell you quickly what they are, because you're all going to go through this at some point. Search is the very first stage, where we are collecting information and experiences that are ultimately going to take us to wherever we go next. The cool thing about it is it's often unintentional. So you're collecting stuff, like James Patterson was like jotting down story ideas and, writing bad books for years while he was an ad executive. So that's your search. The next stage is your struggle. And now the struggle is the part we don't like to talk about. It is when you are leaving your previous identity behind, but you have not figured out what the new one is yet, and you're in the middle. It feels miserable. And we don't like to talk about it because we feel like a failure. We feel like it's only us. It's very lonely, but in fact, everyone goes through it. The problem is we have what I call the Cinderella myth in our society, which is we've been brought up on Cinderella and Spider-Man and Superman and American Idol. We've been brought up on this idea that transformation should be instant. And when it isn't that way for us, we feel like we have failed and we feel like we are stuck. But what I found in all the research and all of my interviews is it feels crummy, but you're actually not stuck. You are actually making a lot of progress. You're just not consciously aware of it. And also everyone goes through with it. Everyone goes through it. And also when you do go through with it, there is nothing wrong with you. It's actually a natural part of the process. It often doesn't end though till you reach stage 3, which is the stop. The stop is the thing that pulls you out of your routine, whether it's something you choose, like I quit my job, or something imposed on you, like I lost my job. But whatever it is, for some people it's an illness or a divorce or a kid going off to college, whatever it is, it pulls you out of your daily routine. And only at that moment, there's all of this other experiences and the struggle and all the things that have been swirling around in your brain. That is when it has a chance to coalesce and give you clarity. And the clarity is what allows you to get to that 4th step, which is the solution, which is wherever you're transitioning to. And I found it to be true for people who have gone through the most different and extreme kinds of pivots, including like a JP Morgan economist who's now a cattle farmer, but also just people who have found sort of a new outlet for their for their interests and their hobbies, their interests, or things that they've learned along the way. And it's so cool because so many of them end up in a place where they never imagined. So it's really important, by the way, when you're going through that, to have an open mind about where your talents might take you. And a lot of the people also, they had to kind of redefine what they thought of as success. Like they always thought success was managing director at an investment bank. And then they realized, very often they get there and realize, yeah, that's not doing it for me, right? And they pivot. So anyway, it's been an incredible journey. But what I find is when I talk about this, so many people relate to that struggle piece of it. I had no idea that it's so common. And I think it is particularly common right now because we are coming out of the pandemic. But we've had this experience where we really have been pulled, that we've had that stop was the pandemic for all of us. And we really are struggling with, our values, our priorities, what work should look like. And it's lonely. And there's a lot of people out there who are feeling lonely right now. And I think it's very affirming to know that they're not alone and that the struggle actually is very productive, even though it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And, this builds off a couple of the recent webinars that we've hosted as well. One with, what do you do once you're fired and, you're not a failure? And then another one that we had, Viviana, I think we had it last week, with career reentry. So I think this resonates a lot with women as you're trying to figure out, okay, I paused, now how do I get back in? And I think you might have mentioned I relaunched in your book.
Yes.
So
yes.
Carol Fishman Cohen was on with us as well, who's fabulous, has done some great work. And then I think the whole thing with the struggle is that identity piece. So I'm a former athlete, and I think even what you're talking about resonates so well when elite athletes, either college athletes, have to transition off, or, you know, you were an Olympic athlete, which I wasn't, but has to, you know, transition into this next world because you've always been known as me, the phenomenal athlete, which is tough. Joanne, we are out of time, but this has been wonderful. I hope our CWIB community, you know, we try these things, you make them up, you hope they work. You know, being that so many of you were on, I think it did. I want to talk about, so I highly recommend this book as well. Next, The Power of Reinvention and Life at Work. Joanne Lipman's latest book. It is phenomenal. I also want to talk about the next book that we are going to do for our book club. This is written by Deepa Purushothaman, who I found on LinkedIn. Turns out she went to the same high school as my kids. She was phenomenal. We had this massive conversation when we first met. She has now joined our board for the Center of Women in Business. She wrote this book called The First, the Few, the Only: How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America. It is phenomenal. It's one of the first books I read that talked about women of color as something more than a euphemism for Black women. So she touches on a bunch of different intersecting identities. It's really powerful. She was the youngest partner at Deloitte. And so that's going to be our next book. So stay tuned for more communication. Book club leaders, we will send you out some communication, and then also we'll look to do a talk back with her probably late September, early October. Doing anything over the summer doesn't work. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Joanne. And we're really grateful. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you for having me. It's great conversation. Appreciate it.